Wonderful to be here with you all. And I was asked to share a few thoughts about the concept of tzedakah, which is often translated as charity. And people who are first learning about the Noahide path, so this doesn't come up in the seven laws explicitly, but most of you probably know that according to many Torah sages, there aren't only seven laws that are obligatory upon Noahides, and there are many, many Torah sages who say that Noahides are obligated in the commandment of giving tzedakah, of giving charity. So I often remark, and I believe this very strongly, that the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit, is a very, very important model, really a headquarters, if you will, for understanding the Noahide lifestyle, because the book of Genesis is the only book in the Bible that really appears prior to the revealing of the Torah. There's no Torah in the book of Genesis. There's no Judaism. All you have is the Noahide path. That's all that really exists, at least according to the text of the Bible. You know, the sages tell us that the Jewish patriarchs were able to somehow prophetically observe all the laws of the Torah that would appear in the book of Exodus. But when a person is just reading the text of the Bible, they don't see that. And so what you have in Genesis is really an entire book that is directed to Noahides, essentially, because there's no Judaism yet. So one of the things we see in the book of Genesis is that tithing, the Hebrew word for tithing is ma'aser, which comes from the word eser, 10. So we see in Genesis already that giving ma'aser, giving a tenth, is already practiced by the patriarchs. So for example, in Genesis chapter 14, verse 20, after Abraham won the First World War. If you remember, there was the War of the Four Kings versus the Five Kings. The Four Kings were victorious, and they took captive Abraham's nephew, Lot. And Abraham then goes to war to rescue his nephew, and Abraham conquers. He's victorious over the Four Kings. And we see in Genesis chapter 14, verse 20, that he gives 10% of the spoils of war to Melchizedek, who was a priest of God. So clearly this is some kind of a charitable donation. He's donating money that ostensibly is his. We'll discuss that a little bit later, but he's giving 10% of what he has earned, and he's giving it away. And then later in Genesis chapter 22, in Genesis chapter 28, verse 22, we see that Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, promises to give 10% to God from whatever God blesses him with. So you see that Jacob pledges 10% of whatever he is blessed with to give to God. Now, what's interesting is that in Genesis chapter 19, we see that God destroys the wicked city of Sodom. This is a very wicked city. For example, back in Genesis chapter 13, verse 13, the Torah says that the people of Sodom were very wicked. People in Sodom were very wicked. And then in Genesis 18, right before God decides to let Abraham know what he plans to do with Sodom, we're told that the sin of Sodom was very grave. But what's interesting is that in Genesis, you don't really see the sin of Sodom spelled out. All we're told is that the people there were very wicked, that their sin was very great, but it's never explicitly articulated. We don't see in Genesis any real description of what was wrong with the people in Sodom. And you don't really discover this until much later in the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel. So in Yechezkel is the Hebrew for Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 49, it tells us that what was the sin of Sodom? It was their failure to support the poor and the needy. So you see already back in the book of Genesis that the Noahide world are held to certain moral standards. These are standards that God expects of people. And by not supporting the poor and the needy, these are people that are involved in a great evil, a great wickedness. So you see already in Genesis both sides of this topic. You see the horrible sinfulness of not giving charity, and you see that the patriarchs engaged in at least this practice of giving a tithe, giving a tenth. Now, tzedakah, this word in Hebrew, is usually, and unfortunately, it's translated as charity. And that's a very misleading translation. Charity, the word charity is related to the Latin word caritas, like in the word charisma. And this is something that's based upon your feelings, your emotions. When someone has charisma, you have a good feeling about them. And so charity is often equated with a feeling of being charitable, that you have a certain pity for people that are suffering, you have a feeling of being generous, and you have a feeling of wanting to help. That's really the meaning of the word charity and being charitable. But that's misleading because the Hebrew word tzedakah has nothing to do with feelings. It has to do not with your emotions. The word tzedakah is related to the word in Hebrew tzedek, and tzedek just means justice, that which is just, that which is right. The truth is that we are not the ultimate owners of our possessions. Whatever we have in this world, it doesn't really belong to us. I want to read a passage from Divrei Hayamim Aleph, First Chronicles chapter 29. First Chronicles chapter 29. It says the following. I'll read from verse 11. Yours, Hashem, is the greatness, the strength, the splendor, the triumph, and the glory, even everything in heaven and earth. Yours, Hashem, is the kingdom and the sovereignty over every leader. And now in verse 12. Wealth and honor come from you, and you rule everything. In your hand is power and strength, and it is in your hand to make anyone great or strong. So now, our God, we thank you and praise your splendorous name. And now verse 14. Listen carefully. For who am I, and what is my people, that we should muster the strength to donate in this manner? For everything is from you, and from your hand have we given to you. Meaning, whatever we give to you, God, it's not ours. It came from you in the first place. So the truth is that the way we look at our possessions is that we are the stewards over what God has blessed us with. God has given us possessions, wealth, money, and we are responsible to use it responsibly. It's not ours to do whatever we feel like doing with it because it's not ultimately ours. It's something that God has entrusted into our hands. And so that's why giving tzedakah is not simply a matter of how you feel. If you happen to feel mercy on someone or you happen to feel generous, tzedakah is based upon the idea of justice, what's right. And therefore, it's simply a requirement. It's not an optional idea because you happen to feel like a good person. It's a requirement to use your possessions and your wealth properly, and that includes helping those who are in need. Now, the truth is that as far as I'm aware, and I often say this, I am not an expert in the Noahide laws. I don't think many people are because they haven't been well developed over the past several thousand years. I'm not aware of any absolute guidelines for Noahides in terms of charitable giving, in terms of giving tzedakah. And so I think it would be appropriate and helpful for Noahides to at least seek some direction from the Jewish tradition. So basically, in terms of the Jewish world, halakha for Jews, there's a minimum requirement of giving 10% of our net income to tzedakah, which means after our basic expenses are met, and it's quite complicated to actually calculate this. If you go online, there are programs online that will help you calculate this idea of tithing. It's called again in Hebrew, ma'aser, M-A-A-S, as in Sam, E-R, ma'aser, calculator. And so you can look at it. It's interesting to take you through the exercise of figuring out what you can calculate as your net income. In any event, that is seen as the minimum amount that a person should give, not less than 10% of their net income. But ideally, people should give up to 20%. Now, again, for people for whom that's going to be a hardship, 10% is fine. But they should know that ideally, if it's possible to give 20%, and in general, people are discouraged from giving more than 20% unless you're in the league of a Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, you're an uber billionaire, where giving even 70 or 80% of your income is not going to hurt you. You'll be left with several $1 billion, and that's fine. You're not going to have problems buying coffee. But normal people should ideally try to give between 10 and 20%. The concern of giving more than 20% is that you yourself may become impoverished, and then you will need to be helped, and that's not helpful. Now, the most famous teaching about tzedakah comes from Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, and he speaks about 8 different levels of giving tzedakah. And you'll see, I'm going to go through them quickly. These are levels that are all basically concerned with the self-esteem of the recipient, meaning that the most important thing when it comes to giving tzedakah is being sensitive to the recipient. Because the truth is, people do not like to receive charity. It's humiliating, it doesn't feel good, and people resent it in a sense. They resent having to go to others for help. And so the most important element in helping people is to be sensitive to this idea of their self-esteem. So Maimonides says that the highest level of helping people is to give them a loan or bring them into a partnership with you or to find them a job, something where they'll be able to make money and support themselves and not need to collect charity. That is the highest level of tzedakah. They will not feel any shame or embarrassment in taking a job. They'll be thrilled. So that's the highest level. The next highest level, meaning one step down from that, is where you don't know who you're giving to, and the person who's receiving doesn't know who you are, meaning it's complete anonymity. So there, again, there's no feelings of embarrassment that are felt by the recipient. This is interesting that in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, they had a chamber. And in this chamber, you could go one person at a time, and you could either leave money there or you could take money out. And when you went in, no one knew what you were doing. You could have been going in order to deposit money. You could have been going in order to take money. And so there, anonymity was protected. People did not know who they were giving to. People did not know who were giving to them. And that's an example of a system where the feelings and the self-esteem of the recipient are guarded and protected. Or in our modern times, this could be done by giving money to an institution that distributes the charitable funds. Now, the downside here is that when you give to such an institution, you're actually going to be using some of your money is going to pay for administrative costs of running the organization. So again, ideally, it's best to try to give 100% of your money should go to the people that need it. But again, when we cannot give our charitable contributions in an appropriate way, so giving to a charity organization that will disperse it for us, and again, the anonymity of who we are is preserved. The recipient doesn't know who's giving it to them, and you don't know who it's going to. That would be the second highest level of giving tzedakah. The third highest level is where the giver, meaning you, know the recipient, you know who your money is going to, but the recipient doesn't know who you are. My grandmother, when we were living in New York, so she would bake for Shabbat, and on Thursday night, she would leave it at the door of people that were very poor. So if you take an envelope of money and you put it under someone's front door in an envelope, so they don't know who you are, but especially if it's cash and you don't write them a personal check. But if you leave an anonymous gift under someone's door, so again, you know who they are, but they don't know who you are, and that's the third highest level of giving tzedakah. The fourth highest level is where the receiver knows who you are, but you don't know who the recipient is. The fifth highest level, meaning that we're getting towards the bottom now, is where you give to someone directly. So you're giving it into their hands, and so you know them and they know you, but you give it to them before they ask for it, meaning you sense that this person needs help, and so you go over to them and you give them some help. The sixth level down is to give someone only after you are asked. So after someone asks, you give them directly into their hand. The seventh level down, meaning that we're getting almost to the lowest level of giving tzedakah, is when you give them less than you should be giving, meaning they come to you, they ask for money, and you give them less than you should be giving them, but you do it cheerfully. You give them an encouraging word, and you do it cheerfully. The worst way, the eighth level, is when you give them an appropriate amount of money, but you do it with a miserable look on your face, like you resent the fact that you're giving them the money. So that's Maimonides' list of the 8 levels of tzedakah. Again, the main element here is the taking into account the feelings and the self-esteem of the recipient. Now, one of the things that everyone struggles with in the world today is the problem of fraud and scams and charlatans, especially when it comes to beggars, especially when it comes to people who are begging for money, who are asking for money. And so Rav Chaim of Tzanz, one of the great Hasidic masters in the 18th century, he had a sharp way of discussing this question of charlatans. He would say that the merit of giving tzedakah is so great, he would say. As a matter of fact, in the Talmud, it says that the merit of tzedakah is as great as all the other commandments combined. So tzedakah is considered to be a very, very great commandment. And so Rav Chaim of Tzanz would say that the merit of giving tzedakah is so great, he said, that I'm happy to give to 100 beggars if only one of them might actually be needy. I'm happy to give to 100 beggars if it turns out that only one of them was actually needy. He says, on the other hand, however, that there are people who behave as if they are exempt. People believe they're exempt from giving charity to 100 beggars if there's a possibility that just one of them might be a charlatan. So again, this is a problem that always existed, and it's a question we have to use our wisdom when we deal with this. I just would like to conclude with one final concept. There's really much more to say. We can give about a 2-hour class. easily on this topic of tzedakah. But I want to end with a very important thought, one last thought. In Psalm chapter 41, the very beginning of Psalm chapter 41, in a Hebrew Bible, it's verse 2. It says, Ashrei maskil el dal. Ashrei, Ashrei is hard to translate. Praiseworthy, fortunate, happy. It's many ways of translating it. Let's use praiseworthy. Praiseworthy is maskil el dal, the one who uses seichel, wisdom, with the needy. That's what King David is telling us here in this psalm, that praiseworthy is the person who, when they're dealing with those in need, uses ingenuity. Again, because the question is, how do you give sensitively? So I want to share two very short stories, which just give you an illustration of how people use their ingenuity when it comes to giving. So some of you might know that in the Jewish world today, there's an institution called the Kollel. Kollel is basically the equivalent of a postgraduate program where people study Torah full time, and they're supported by the community. So there are men today who get very little money. I mean, people don't make a lot of money in Kollel. Often they get supported by their parents or their in-laws, or their wife has a job, but they get a stipend and they are able to study Torah full time. Now, some people in Kollel do not have wealthy parents, do not have wealthy in-laws, and they may have 10 kids and their wife can't work. And these are people that struggle to get by on their Kollel stipend. So there was such a story where there was two friends in a Kollel. One of them, thank God, was okay, but his friend literally was struggling to get by. But his friend did not like taking any help. He did not like the idea of people giving him help, giving him anything. So his friend had a brilliant idea one day. His friend came into the Kollel and said to his friend, you know what? I was in the supermarket and I saw that they have a huge sale today on cans of tuna fish. Huge sale. They're selling the tuna fish for half off, 1/2 price, because there's a whole shipment that came in and all the cans are dented. They're dented and they can't get full price. So he said, would you like me to buy a case for you? You know, I'm not going to give it to you as a gift. You'll pay me, but I'll pick it up for you. And his friend was thrilled. I'm going to get tuna fish for half price. What a deal. What a bargain. So this fellow went home, got his son. They went to the supermarket. They bought a case of obviously perfectly good tuna fish. They brought it home and they took out 2 hammers and they started denting the tuna fish cans. And he was able to bring it to his friend. And his friend didn't know that this was a ruse, didn't know that this was a ploy, but he felt that he got a bargain, and he felt that he wasn't getting a handout. He wasn't getting charity. He just got a good deal. He got a good deal from the supermarket. That's one story that gives you an example. Again, if someone is thinking with their seicha, with their ingenuity, how you can sensitively help some people. One last story. It's about this great Hasidic Rebbe who passed away in the 1900s. I think he passed away in 1969 approximately. He was the Satmar Rebbe. Satmar Rebbe, the Satmar Hasidim are a huge Hasidic group in the world today, very large group. And the Rebbe, his name was Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, a very, very tremendous, righteous person. And Satmar is known for being very charitable, extremely generous group. And people would come to the Satmar Rebbe from all over the world for help when they had difficulties. So there was and this group was based in Brooklyn, New York, in Williamsburg section of Brooklyn. And there was once an Israeli fellow, not Hasidic, he was a regular Israeli, you know, he wore a little tiny knitted kippah on his head, far from being Hasidic. and he needed money because his wife was having a very serious surgery, and he needed to collect a lot of money. So he came to the Satmar Rebbe, and the Satmar Rebbe asked him, what are you here for? And he said, my wife is having surgery, and I need to raise money for her. And the Rebbe asked, how much are you asking for? And he said, I'm asking for $20,000. So the Rebbe told his assistant to write this person a check for $19,700. $19,700. And the fellow was thrilled. He was so happy he got such a big check, because you can imagine if you're asking someone for $20,000, they may give you $100 and send you on your way. So the fellow left, but the assistant to the Rebbe was very puzzled. He said to the Rebbe, I don't understand. He came in here, he was asking for $20,000, and you give him $19,700. Just $300 more. Why don't you give him the whole $20,000 already? So the Rebbe says, you don't understand. If I had given him a check for $20,000, he would have left here very upset. He would have been kicking himself that he didn't ask for more money. So the fact that he got $19,000 and $700, he was thrilled. He was thrilled. This is an example of, again, someone who's maskil el dal, someone who is using their ingenuity, their sensitivity in dealing with someone that's in need. So that's basically what I had to share. It's a starting point. There's a lot more to study. There's a world of literature you can find just online dealing with this whole topic of tzedakah.